you want us to type our name in the box, or what would you like?
Yes, please. Put your name and jurisdiction in the box.
Okay. All right.
Thanks, Jerry.
Well, I think we'll get underway. It's a little bit past 5 and folks are, I think, still joining us, but we'll get underway just the same. So good afternoon, everyone. The purpose of this afternoon's meeting is to update the region's transportation planning organization's policy boards on the status of the Connect Beyond Regional Mobility Initiative. Now, for CRTPO board members, we usually hold education sessions at this time, as you know, before the regular meeting at 6 p.m. This is still an education session, but it's a bit different from the others because the boards of all the region's transportation planning organizations have been invited to attend. So same education session, but a much bigger audience, and I appreciate all those who have attended who normally don't join us at this time. I think most of you are probably aware that Connect Beyond is a 12-county bi-state effort to define a single coordinated transit vision for the greater Charlotte region, and that it's being jointly led by the Central Line of Regional Council and the Charlotte Area Transit System. Work started on Connect Beyond a little over a year ago, and that work is quickly advancing to completion this fall with the next phase of work focused on near-term implementation activities. It's anticipated that draft Connect Beyond recommendations will be coming out this summer. And because all of the region's transportation planning organizations will play a key role in endorsing the plan and equally important, coordinating its implementation, the project management team felt it was important to engage the region's policy boards today to talk about project recommendation, project status and schedule updates, and the role of the transportation planning organizations in endorsement. We'll also hear from you about your priorities and interests through a brief engagement activity, and then we'll wrap up with ways that you can help take action to further the Connect Beyond effort locally. One thing I did want to note is that earlier today we offered a similar presentation to the technical committees of the transportation planning organizations, and we had over 70 people take time to participate. So I think that's a pretty good sign of the high interest in this important project. So with that, I will turn it over to Michelle Nance with the Central Line of Regional Council. Michelle?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having us here to talk about a project that is dear to my heart, but most importantly, will impact communities throughout the region. And I'll just echo what Bob said. You know, we've had several great meetings this week, actually, 2 yesterday for Central Line of board members, one for more rural focused and one more urban focused. And then today we had a roundtable of planners from across the region, and we also had over 65 people join us on that call. So super excited about this and glad to be here today. We have limited time, so we are going to move through a lot of slides pretty quickly. But the good news is after the meeting, we will be sharing the slides as well as additional materials that, and we're always here for you if you've got questions about this project. So next slide. This just gives you a little outline of what we'll be talking about, and we're not going to even take probably that much time, but we'll go through a little bit of the background about where we are, where we're headed, what's next. Since you're on an MPO board, a little bit about your role and the endorsement of the project, and actually through implementation. And then we're going to, most important part is then we're going to ask you a series of questions and engage with you on that, and then we'll wrap up. So thank you. Next slide. And so since we have multiple MPOs on the call, just wanted to share, a thank you to all our MPO staff that, sent the word out and made sure that folks were here. Next slide. I'd like to just start with the why we're actually doing this. And I really like this slide because it's a 1928 picture of the opening of the bridge across the Catawba. The World War I memorial bridge that is just now on the books to be updated, and it really demonstrates the once in a century chance that we have to get things right related to infrastructure and investment. So the other thing is, if you look to see the population and the fact that we're going to close to double in the next few decades. It's something we have to get right. We have to have our transportation in the right place for the population that's coming. Next slide. So just wanted to share this in several of our meetings. We've had, of course, the ex officio mayors that are on the Metropolitan Transit Commission board, policy board for CATS. And they really understand the economic benefits of this project and how important it is to connect their communities, not only to Charlotte and Charlotte, Mecklenburg and communities there, but all across the region, connections from, Huntersville to Concord, from Gastonia to Lincolnton and all around the region. So they're in support and we're glad to have them with us. Next. And when we're thinking about attracting and retaining businesses within this region, one of the things that we just wanted to demonstrate, and this was done so well at a previous meeting by LJ Wazlowski from Ryder Transit, and it's really just a demonstration of a resident that was trying to get from Salisbury to a medical facility. And you can see here that the time involved to get to that medical facility in Huntersville. And frankly, nobody has that much time, to get to an appointment. And if you go to the next slide, the return trip was actually no better. So in terms of time spent, going there and coming back, we're looking at over an 8-hour ride on transit, multiple transfers, multiple systems. And if the person tried to take Uber, it's going to be, close to $75. And that's just cost prohibitive for so many people. So this is really just a demonstration of, one of many, many, many stories all across the region of people trying to get places. And we know that to be competitive, we've got to do better here. Next slide. And so not to put the, end before the beginning, but I like to have purpose in how we go through this. And you're going to see a map in just a minute that has high capacity transit corridors on it. It's got mobility corridors. And I just want you to be thinking about a few things as you go through. And that is, every community is different. They have different transportation needs. But one of the things that Connect Beyond is doing is creating a vision for how mobility can occur across the region. Next slide. And the thought here is, if the vision is how we interconnect transit, how we can offer opportunities to guide infrastructure and growth along those corridors, communities can actually use that map to help them create interesting, high quality places that have a higher return on investment. And that vision and predictability is something that the development community is looking for. They want to know that whoever goes next door is actually doing something similar or at least as high quality. Next, please. And that's really going to require us to work together. And we always talk about we got to work together. Well, here's where it really gets real. In these corridors, we have to have coordinated investments, not only in transportation and making those connections, but also in land use. We've got to make sure that where those higher density, developments go, they can go anywhere, but they need to be pushed to the corridors for sure in order to make sure that we have successful transportation in the future. Next. And we also know that as elected leaders, you're going to need support from your staff and others to provide you with the information that you can use to help educate, your residents, and, you as leaders need to be equipped with those talking points and, to let folks know why it's important to the community to have good connected transit. Next. So every project has an origin story. Those of you who have been around the region a while, you've heard about Connect Our Future. After that, we spent a couple years out and about in the region, just really understanding what the needs were related to transit. And that really led to the scope of work for Connect Beyond Next. And that has, this project is supported by, the folks that you see there, awesome transportation agencies across the region, in addition to 17 transit agencies, believe it or not, across the region. Next. And so all these folks came together, and about 2 weeks before the pandemic hit, we kicked off the meeting, and we have been flexing and adjusting and pivoting ever since, but we're really proud about where we are now. Next. And these folks came together to say, look, we're going to work together and we're going to get this thing done. Next. And so what is this region? The region for this project is 12 counties across 2 states. A lot of geography there, as you can see, a lot of population, a lot of partners, as I mentioned, including the transit agencies that really kind of leads us to, the importance of coordination. Next. And, even if you as an elected official haven't been directly involved in this, we just wanted to let you know that your people have. We've got 3 advisory committees that come together almost monthly to talk about some technical things, policy issues. And we've got these 3 groups really represent, not only elected officials, but transportation and land use staff, but then the community advisory committee is folks from, hospitals and, higher education and economic development folks, major employers. Next. And so what is this plan going to do? First and foremost, it's going to create a shared vision that people can get behind as they think through, how are we going to move forward? And, I'll just be really, really frank, thinking about the need for new revenue streams. You've got to have a vision. You got to have a vision of where you're headed. You got to have something to get excited about. And that's what we're trying to do here. We've looked at high capacity transit corridors. We've put those out. You're going to see another map with that on there. And then basically we'll come up with the strategies on how to get it done, just like, any good plan. Next. These will not be a surprise to you. Through all of our engagement, these are the types of things we heard that people were, struggling with and that they valued in a transportation system, specifically transit. So again, I don't think that any of these are going to be new to you. Next. And just looking at this, everybody does tend to get excited about high capacity transit. But as you can see, that is, in this case, the icing on the cake. But really, that is the spine. But everything else is much more. There's so much more of it. Any good transit system is based on rubber tires, and that's how most of the people are getting around. And you can see that here. You can see a combination of bus and that local sidewalk and the bike lanes and the scooters. And so much of this can be done locally to create those connection points, to create those great places. Even before we start talking about something that's going to potentially happen 20 to 30 years down the road. Next. And this just shows a good slide of the process and where we are. As I mentioned, we do have the advisory committee structure in place, but each time this group meets, we've got national and regional folks coming in to give us best practices that they've had in their region, and the advisory committee is hearing from the technical groups. Anyway, and that's how we're building the plan. You can see where we are. We've got a meeting next week related to urban and rural connections. And then kind of bottom line, draft recommendations will be coming out in the summer, and we'll be moving toward final recommendations later in the fall. Next. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Lawrence to talk through some of the technical aspects of the plan. Jason?
Thank you, Michelle. It's good to be in front of you guys again. I'm Jason Lawrence for the Charlotte Area Transit System Senior Planner, and been in front of you a couple times talking about the system update and this plan here, and excited to get this plan to a point where we're close to recommendations and next steps, and we're really excited about that. And if you go to the next slide, Theo, just pause for a moment here. When you think about who this region and who we are and the growth that we've talked about, and you look at the regions that we are competing with for talent, for employment, for the next big thing, that some of that is with these regions on the screen right now, the Austins, the Atlanta, Denvers, and the Nashvilles, where they're also experiencing a lot of growth. And what they have that we don't currently have in this region is a regionally coordinated transit system plan. All those places have that in various forms, either in planning or in construction, like Denver, where they've already implemented a number of corridors. And so we really truly believe that this effort is the piece that can help us, step up into the ranks of cities that we compete with on a daily basis. And we've done that before in this region. If you go to the next slide, we've done a regional vision at a different level back in the 90s, talking with centers and corridors that led to the Mecklenburg County plan that led to the 2025 Transit and Land Use Plan that was put in front of voters for approval in 1998, which led to the Hassett sales tax, which to date has funded the 5-corridor transit system plan and improved bus services within Mecklenburg County. And this plan is no different as we look to find ways to put ideas and potential recommendations in front of this board and many others, but they have to be founded upon guiding principles. And each of I'll go through quickly through these guiding principles on the next series of slides. Our plan is founded on these efforts, on these guiding principles, but in some ways we have to meet the moment on each of these. And so on the next slide, we have, creating mobility choices. Congestion is coming to this region, growth is coming to this region. What are the mobility choices this plan can offer? What is that moment when we know that we're going to need new choices and new mobility options? Big guiding principle for this effort. Next slide, advancing equity. We know that maybe every part of our region is in different places when it comes to advancing equity and affordable housing and access to education and opportunity. What is that moment where this regional plan can help make all those connections for people across this region to advance equity? On the next slide, preparing for future growth. It's probably almost redundant at this time. We've said it so many times, but it's so true. All we have to do is look back at the last 20 years to see where the growth has got us to this point, and it's going to be that again in the next 20 years. So what is the next generation of rapid transit corridors and mobility plans that can help us meet that moment? On the next slide, advancing plans and local visions. It's so important that this is, of course, a big regional plan, 12 counties. I think earlier, Jason Wager from Central London says, our plan area is almost the size of Rhode Island. It's almost the size of an entire state. But it has to be developed locally, and it's got to line up with local visions and local mobility plans in order to be successful. And then ultimately, the final guiding principle is how do we implement it? How do we plan for implementation? How do we think through federal, state, and funding guidelines? As Michelle said earlier, it will come down to funding, and we got to understand how that funding works across our boundaries and what partnerships can we make to complete this plan, but also what are the things we can do right now that are available to us? What tools do we have to start coordination today? We're going to lay out those paths as we get closer to recommendations later this fall. On the next slide, I'll just bring up the high capacity transit corridors again. Should come to no surprise to me when you start thinking about the major transportation infrastructure within our region, the 77s, the 74s, the Highway 16s, the Albemarle roads. Those were obvious choices for us as we started thinking about what that next generation of rapid transit corridors and how do we begin to advance them in this region. But they will only be as successful as the light green lines on the map, those mobility corridors. What are those interconnecting corridors and routes to make those nodes and high capacity transit corridors successful? So as we start to look at future bus rapid transit lines, emerging technologies, light rail transit, future commuter rail that could potentially operate along some of our freight corridors, how do we begin to advance those and through all those strategies that Michelle laid out earlier? And speaking to that bus network strategies on the next slide, a big focus of this effort is like, how do we build a better bus network? Michelle showed that example of somebody trying to get to Salisbury to Huntersville and how long that took. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that some of those transit agencies that Michelle talked about were in that, like Salisbury Transit, Ryder Transit in Concord and Kannapolis, and then of course CAS, and then making all those connections. How do we make that more seamless and more approachable by our riding public? And if you go to the next slide, you can see that network that's there. When you think about, well, there's ICAS, there's Ryder Transit, MyRide in Rock Hill, and Gaston Transit over in Gastonia. The lines are there, but what's not there is the frequency and the coordination and the ability to share fare payment across all those different modes. That's the missing pieces that we need to think through. How do we improve the frequency? Because it's not rocket science to make good bus service. At the end of the day, it's frequency and convenience and the ability to understand how to connect between modes. And that's a big, one of our key recommendations coming out of this is like, how do we achieve that? And we feel like, what will be in that recommendation of how to improve the bus systems across our region. On the next slide, we have 6 key areas that we truly feel that this is how we can get there. One, let's look at our policies. Metropolitan Transit Commission already has a policy in place to share costs and do regional express services. We have a service to Gastonia, we have service to Union County and to Monroe. How do we, look at more regional express services? How do we build that transit market along our interstates and future HOV lanes and existing HOV lanes? What about local service and fare policy? How does that fit together? Technology, how can we see each other in the same, app infrastructure? How do we, from real time, know when a rider transit vehicle from Concord is arriving at the JW Clay Boulevard station at the light rail in UNC Charlotte? Operational, how do we schedule together? What if we had the same scheduling software so that we could see all the different routes and plan together? Financial, what's the funding model and makeup of that? How does that look? Because that is a question we'll have to address. Interagency coordination, that kind of umbrellas all of that. How do we start working together and coordinate our plans? And then how do we educate and do outreach to the public so they understand and know the different connections that are possible? And that's not the only connections that this effort will be recommending. We also have a few other tasks that are attached to this. And if you go to the next slide, transportation demand management, overall, how do we provide more choices, not just on bus or bus rapid transit or light rail or commuter rail, but what about coordination with land use and development from a policy level, coordinating carpools at our park and rides, van pool, coordinating all the different infrastructure improvement plans that are happening in each of the communities, and so that we have a more holistic approach to managing the transportation need. And so TDM will be a key effort that will also be coming out with recommendations on later this year. Emerging mobility on the next slide. A lot has changed over the past 20 years. Cell phones, lots of things that we didn't have just 10 years ago, like scooters, are now a part of the transportation ecosystem. So how do we integrate all these different things to really future ready our system? The e-bus conversion that's going on here in Katz has already happened in my ride. How do we think about that in an overall understanding of how all these interconnected vehicles could work? So emerging mobility and mobility hubs will be a big piece of our recommendations. Rural to urban on the next slide, Michelle mentioned that'll be an upcoming presentation at our Joint Advisory Committee meeting on Wednesday of next week. Not every county has fixed route, but every county in our study area has human services and paratransit services. That is truly the piece that ties us all together. And so how do we effectively coordinate those medical trips and veteran services and disabled communities together and through it in a more holistic manner? We'll talk more about that next week at our Joint Advisory Committee meeting. And then finally, and ultimately, at our June meeting, we'll be unveiling some ideas and strategies about implementation and the partnerships and transit supportive strategies, because at the end of the day, this really will affect land use, and land use really affects transportation. So how do we tie this together at the land use level to support the transportation recommendations? And then to the next slide, just a recap of some of those meetings that Michelle mentioned that we got coming up. Got joint advisories next week on Wednesday. Then on June, we have that Transportation Supportive Strategies Implementation meeting in June. And then we'll come with recommendations out with final recommendations in September of this year. And we'll be coming back to this body to discuss those in more detail. And now I'll hand it off to Michelle to talk about our path to recommendations.
Next slide, please. So this just is a graphic form of some of the things we've already discussed. We've got lots of technical work groups that are looking at very particular things. Building a better bus network. How do we improve the frequency and make sure that our routes are meeting up between systems? What types of transportation demand management, or things like van pool and telecommuting. How can those things really help us squeeze out every last bit of capacity that we can get from the highways in the region? And as you can see, other groups are meeting, including a group that's meeting on funding and partnerships, because we know as we move forward, those things are going to be highly important, and we have to have thought that through and have a path forward for how we're going to work together and how we're going to increase revenues to get this done. So all that said, technical groups are working. They're pushing things forward. Recommendations are being created, and those recommendations will be certainly in draft form in July, and then we'll move forward to the advisory committee for their feedback later in the summer. Next. And really, this is just a kind of a zoom in between June and October, but it's kind of important to you in that once we get through the joint advisory committee, we're going to be coming back out to the MPOs and the RPOs, and we'll be asking for some sort of an endorsement, whether that could be a letter of support, it could be a resolution, really just depends. But those are the types of interactions that we'll be having with the MPO and RPO boards as we get closer to the end. The Central Lina Board of Delegates and the MTC, the Metropolitan Transit Commission, will actually do the final endorsement of this plan. That's where it will live. But next slide. How does all this get implemented, right? I mean, it's a lot. Policies, operations, a lot of things happening here. So once the plan is done, this thing gets broken back out. Each MPO will have some very specific targeted strategies for their geography and the types of transit that they operate at this time. Our transit providers will have some targeted strategies directed towards them, as will the MTC and Central Lina. And there may even be some things coming down for the local governments, especially in terms of land use coordination with transportation. That's something that we can't miss. Okay, we've got to be talking about land use too. All right, next. So with that, we're actually we did pretty good on time. We've got about 15 minutes to get some good feedback from you, and I'm going to turn it over to Sabrina Colon from HDR. She's on our consultant team and is going to guide us through some of this engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I just want to confirm you all can see my Mentimeter screen. All right, so to get some feedback from you all, we'd like for you to either go to another browser in your on your computer or pull out your phone and go to menti.com, and the code there is 61124521. And then I'm also going to drop, we've got the code in the chat there. Thank you, Judy. I'm also going to drop a quick link as well. You should be able to take you directly there. So again, if you go to menti.com, that code is 61124521, and you can do that from your phone, or you can do that from another tab in your browser. And so we just want to ask a couple of questions to get your feedback on what you've heard. Okay. So the first question, kind of looking at the recommendation categories, kind of ranking them in the order that's the most important to your MPO or RPO or community. And so I'm going to give you guys a moment to kind of look through these. And if you could just rank them on your phone or on your browser, you select your first one, and then it'll give you the option to add your second one as you go down through 8. And I'm just going to read them all. So the one, a regionally coordinated system created to support ongoing implementation. Collaborative funding models, so seeking and obtaining funding based on a collective of regional and local goals. Transportation choices, so reducing the demand on highway infrastructure and the use of emerging transportation technologies. Implementing new or enhanced high frequency transit and high capacity transit mobility, moving around. Human services transportation coordination, transit supportive development, mobility hubs, and then fixed route coordination. And so again, if you could just kind of rank those as those that are most important to your MPO or RPO or your community, not to say that one is not overarching, they're all important in some capacity, but what would have the most impact for your area. And I can see that 2 people have added. We'll give you guys some time. I know ranking 8, it's a little bit of thought, so I want to give you enough time to kind of think through that. I love it. We can see kind of immediately. So far, transportation choice, reducing that demand on highways kind of has stayed towards the top. And if some of the next few we have coming up are some yes or no answers. So this will be one of the longer ones. I want to spend a little bit more time on this first one just to give you guys a chance to give that feedback. Okay. The regionally coordinated system created to support ongoing implementations of those partnerships. Sticking towards the top as well as transportation choices. Let me see if I get a few more in before we move on to the next question. All right. We'll give about 30 more seconds on this one, and then we'll move on. Perfect. Right. So what's kind of stuck towards the top, the two that have kind of fought for first and second place is the regionally coordinated system and then transportation choices. Down from there, the collaborative funding models, mobility hubs have been pretty close. And then our other four. So thank you all for taking the time to rank those. I'm going to go to the next question for the sake of time. And so this is really just a kind of a yes or no to get a good feel. So are you willing to work with your neighboring communities to advance the coordinated development and mobility options in high capacity transit corridors, or to coordinate cross community mobility options in rural areas? So these questions really kind of seem the ability or willingness to work with those neighboring communities. And it is anonymous. And so far I've got all yeses. And if you have any, if you'd like to leave any additional comments kind of related to your yes or your no, feel free to drop that in the chat. You can also drop that in the chat privately as well. Okay. So on this next question, I'd like to, this is a kind of a scale from kind of strongly disagree to agree, and then how your willingness for each of these areas. So 1, to work with adjoining communities on land development goals, to work with adjoining communities on infrastructure investment priorities, to work with communities in your county on creating funding streams to meet transportation needs, and then to work with communities in the 12 county region through a formal structure to advance transit projects. So, that yes or no, we've got, there's a lot of people that are willing to do that work, but kind of what are the specific areas where it makes sense that you feel to work with adjoining communities? And if you're not quite sure, kind of that middle don't know or neutral would be the center point for this. Okay. We recognize there's a lot of barriers and factors that go in the ability to work with adjoining communities. So it looks like funding streams is ranked, and infrastructure investment priorities ranked the highest. All right. can go to the next question. So again, this one is on enhancing development activity. So would your community benefit from education and technical expertise related to enhancing development activity along the corridors? Is that something that, yes or no, just a yes or no question that have interest of your community? Okay. Looks like majority yes, some no's. All right. I'm gonna go ahead and move to the next one. So again, so this is benefit from education and technical expertise related to enhancing a variety of mobility options in your identified activity centers. So as far as mobility options, would your community benefit from that, from education and technical expertise about related to enhancing a variety of mobility options? Okay. We've got 2 more questions after this that are open-ended. So again, a majority of yes. All right. So I'll move to the next. Thank you. So for this question, this is an open-ended. So what do you see as the challenges to implementing the Connect Beyond Regional Mobility Initiative? From your perspective, what do you think would be the biggest challenges to being able to really think regionally about our transportation network? And you can enter multiple times for this if you've got more than one. So funding, politics and funding, more funding. So the towns and the cities with the loudest voices can win. Again, politics, funding, being able to collaborate cross-jurisdictionally. And I think we're clearly seeing some trends in what some of the concerns would be. A lot of that is, again, working with the funding, then being able to work with Charlotte as the larger kind of city in the center, funding with unique needs of each, the lack of political will. Differing growth mindsets, fear of change, co-opting the agenda by the outsiders with unwelcome political agendas. Okay. All right, thank you all for, you can keep adding, make sure I've seen all the ones that have come in. So we're definitely seeing some trends in what in the thoughts that are coming in from the open-ended. Obviously a lot to do with funding itself, you know, and I think there's different ways we've talked about the ability and need to collaborate and making sure that there's all voices are heard at the table. So involving stakeholders early in the process as well. So thank you all for those thoughts. I'm going to move to this last question, which is another open-ended one. So moving forward to implementation, so getting to that space, you know, what organizations need to be involved from your community network? So again, what organizations do you feel need to be involved? We talked a lot about, or some thoughts have come up around the ability to collaborate. Who needs to be at that table? So we've made sure they've been brought in early. And again, this is another one that's open-ended, and you can put in multiple chamber, economic development, planning. I'm saying planning departments across all the, multiple jurisdictions, economic development organizations across different organizations or within city governments, planning boards, health services, the legislator, the MPOs. And I'm proud to say that I think we have begun to tap into the networks that we're seeing here, Sustain Charlotte and other bike ped centered orgs. They are on our advisory, our technical advisory committees, the residents, of course, NCDOT, General Assembly, City Council, County Commissioners, planning staff, directors, realtors, county, city, political organizations, law enforcement and first responders. That's a good one. Okay. So thank you all for taking the time. I know we're running up on the time here, so I want to go ahead and hand it back to project management team, but thank you all for taking the time to give us that feedback. Again, you can always continue to give us feedback through any of our project management team, as well as contact@connect-beyond.com as well, or on our website, connect-beyond.com. Thank you.
And as if on cue, here's the website and the contact information. If you have any additional questions, sometimes when you're doing the polling, you'll think of something later on and wish that you had said it. We're open ears. I just wanted to say that, we've been at this, a little over a year now in terms of this project. But even when we get to quote final recommendations and we have the plan, this is really the start of a journey, right? It doesn't end. We will continue to be talking about this. There will always be more work to be done. So thank you for everything that you do in your own community and in service to the MPO or RPO. We will be sending you a follow-up email with the slides and some additional information. So feel free to click those links when you get them. If you want to, be a Connect champion, feel free to put this information on your website. We can help you populate your newsletters as they go out. Just, have your PIO contact us if you have one. If not, anybody at the organization, just let us know. We're also glad to come out and do, speaking gigs in your community. And you'll see here, there's a link to a transportation choices survey. This is not necessarily for you unless you're a business owner, but send it out to the businesses in your community. They are scrambling to try to get folks into work. And we know that transportation is a major barrier. So we want to hear from them on what their needs are as well. So with that, I'll just say thank you for having us here. Thank you for the project team, for all the CRTPO staff, for helping us to pull this together, and all the other MPO leads. Really appreciate it, and hope everybody has a nice night and a great rest of your meeting. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michelle. We appreciate it, and Jason and Sabrina for the help tonight for a great presentation. We asked for you to wrap up at 5:45. It's 5:46. I think you're within the margin of error. So great job. Thank you. For the CRTPO board members, we would ask that you stay on this line at this link. Our board meeting will begin promptly at 6 p.m. For those of you from other MPOs who participated today, we appreciate you taking the time to do so. You're welcome to stick around and listen to the CRTPO board meeting if you like, but I suspect you might be wanting to do some other things this evening. So, but again, thanks to everyone, for the folks from Central Ina, CATS, and HDR, and for the CRTPO board members, stay tuned. We'll reconvene at 6 p.m.